Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Our current leadership, which is on the wrong side of history, will be consigned to the dustbin of history. I'm talking about our Western leadership.
Joining Center Stage today is David Hurst, a veteran journalist who co-founded the Middle East Eye. Hurst has seen just about everything, the rise of Putin in Russia, as well as the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. He says that nothing that Western government and NATO have tried in these countries in the last 30 years has worked. And now he says the West is repeating its mistakes with the war on Gaza. David Hurst, editor-in-chief for Middle East Eye, welcome to Center Stage. You're kind of a rock star in our career, in our field. Or in other words, less poppy words, you are a veteran journalist. You worked on so many conflicts around the world. Is history repeating itself?
Well, chickens are coming home to roost, if you want another metaphor. I was a correspondent in Yeltsin's Russia. In fact, I saw the Soviet Union flag go down on the Russian parliament in 1991. And what then happened in the next 10 years in front of my eyes, we didn't know that Putin existed, was a complete disaster. It was Western forces, like a Klondike. It was the West trying to break and remake Russia in its own image, not just in its own image, in the image of a neoliberal, a really kind of vicious, they called it diki capitalism, wild capitalism. And it really didn't work. And it produced Putin. The same thing happened in Iraq. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. You had Yemen. You had the civil war in Libya. You've had one disaster after another. Nothing that the Western Alliance and the NATO have done in the last 3 decades has worked. And yet, it's still going on.
Who failed us for it to keep going on?
Well, I think what's happening at the moment is actually a very, very big event. I think that the West had a really good opportunity after the end of the Soviet Union to rebuild the world order. And through greed and arrogance, they thought they were the only man standing, and they would push NATO eastwards, and that created the wars. And it also created a nationalist Russia with disastrous results. I went all around Ukraine during that period, and what's happened in Ukraine is an absolute disaster from which I don't think the country will ever recover. And it's arrogance, it's a belief that you can only be right, and incredibly, we are using the same people who got us into this mess to advise us on what to do now. You have Tony Blair suddenly becoming the elder statesman advising Keir Starmer. And it's a disaster. And I think what we're seeing, as I saw in 1991, there were virtually no communists left when I arrived in Moscow. The faith had completely evaporated. No one believed in a dictatorship of the proletariat. They were all capitalists. They were totally pro-Western. And we turned a country like that into a completely anti-Western country. Why did we do this? And I think now, 3 decades on, 4 decades on, the same thing is happening here to our own liberal democracies. Firstly, they're not that liberal. They're using extremely illiberal means to protect their liberalism, and they're using it against Muslims. They wouldn't dare to do that against Jews or to synagogues, but you actually have laws in France that dictate what a good Islam as opposed to bad Islam, whatever that means, or separatism. Disgusting things are happening all over Europe. And they're not the victim of the rise of the far right. They create it. Their lack of governance They're building states that don't protect their people. And Britain is a rich country. And you have nurses in Britain who have to choose between either feeding their family or heating their home. Now, how is that possible in a rich country? There are things going on which are really incredible. And I think what we're seeing is we're seeing the collapse of the Western model.
Is it really the collapse, or is it really just reinventing itself? Because when we look at the speech of not now the far right, because the limits between far right and left is now so vague, with politicians adopting far right nationalist speech, populist speech, xenophobic speech. Is it really a collapse, or is it just it never really cured from its racism?
Well, if it isn't checked, it will become a really big force. It's becoming a big force anyway. So I don't think that we should have any complacency about the far right. I think what we've got to address is the failure of governance, is the failure to provide a strong state, is the failure to narrow the gaps between the excessively rich and everyone else. It's the failure of privatization. It's the failure of an extended post-industrial capitalist model, which is failing people. They had the opportunity in the 90s to really change the way the world order was, because the West was the last man standing. It had a system that worked, and it squandered that opportunity. It wanted the whole cake for itself. And I think now you have quite profound problems. For instance, we're speaking the 75th anniversary of NATO. There's a real problem with NATO, and that is that NATO could split in the northern countries, in Northern Europe, being much more hawkish about defense, particularly against Russia, and the southern NATO countries saying, hey, what are you doing? We don't want World War III. There are lots of problems. There is Trump in the wings. We have just had an election in Britain in which the path to power of Keir Starmer was to say, on one of the biggest issues that was happening during his period of opposition, that Israel had the right to defend itself. And he voted against every attempt of a ceasefire. He even said in an LBC program that Israel had the right to deprive Gaza of water and electricity. This is now our prime minister. But it was cynically his way to power.
This rise and this big wave of far right, how long do you think it will go? And will it take ethnic cleansing or genocide like we saw here 30 years ago to actually stop it this time?
The rise of the far right, as I said, is a symptom of a bigger sickness. If that sickness carries on, and if we really, really don't change, then I can see lots of things happening. I can see violent demonstrations and clashes between protesters on the streets in Britain or in France. I think there is a difference, however, between genocides. And there was a difference between the genocide of Srebrenica and Gaza. And the biggest difference was that where the Dutch peacekeepers just stood and watched and did nothing in Srebrenica, you cannot say that America is sitting by watching and doing nothing. It's providing heavy bombs to Israel as we speak. Britain is doing the same.
But yet they get the veto right at the UN Security Council.
Absolutely. And as far as the starvation of Gaza is concerned, which is worse now than ever before, and it suddenly dropped off the headlines, what America is doing is allowing Israel to virtually seal all the land borders, just let the minimum through. It itself has now withdrawn this pier, which is now going to be relocated in Ashdod. Ashdod, the port, where boatloads of aid from Turkey stood for 3 months because it was designated as UNRWA, and they had to get it redesignated as WFP. And Israel's agenda is very simple. It is to push as many Palestinians as it can into the sea. It's very clear what they're doing. This is enforced starvation. The starvation doesn't just happen. And I'm very glad I don't work for an organization that uses the passive tense, or a lot of Western organizations. You just say, it happens. You don't actually say why it happens, and you don't say who is doing it.
When we see the narrative in Gaza, and we compare it in a very recent war, which is Ukraine, we are seeing up until today headlines that show a lot of difference in the way we portray and we empathize and we sympathize with Ukrainians in mainstream Western media and with Gazans. I'm not saying we should not sympathize with Ukrainians, but what about Gazans? Why is Western journalism failing Gaza?
There was one very famous case where they said, hey, look, these Ukrainians look just like us. Pure racism. They were white. But what happened was that you had one conflict where you're allowed to say that the occupier was evil, that he didn't recognize Ukraine, and that he was causing a lot of suffering, all of which is true. And that armed resistance against this occupier was justified. And on the other, you have a very, very long-running occupation where you're not allowed to say that the occupier is evil. There's even an attempt by pro-Israel supporters and by Republicans to stop calling it the occupation and start calling it disputed territories. And armed resistance is evil. And it's the complete reverse of that coin. There is a huge wave of public opinion which says this war has to stop and in favor of a Palestinian state. But we don't have the elected representatives that actually are brave enough to say that. And so the more people who say that, there will be a wave. There will be this whole system of justifying the unjustifiable will not last. In that sense, I'm an optimist. And we are seeing the end of this system and the birth of a new one, I hope based on the UN, and I hope based on the sort of things that we should have been doing 30 years ago. But as in any real revolution, the collapse of these elites is going to be violent. They don't take it lying down, and it's going to take some time. This will not be an easy process. I don't think the far right will take over, but I do think that our current leadership, which is on the wrong side of history, will be consigned to the dustbin of history. I'm talking about our Western leadership.
How can we now in 2024, how can we actually push for political stand that is not reflective after 30 years, but stopping it while it's happening?
You can do your job and you can be there and put this information out. And I think everyone's just got to do their job and speak out and challenge people and challenge politicians about what is actually they mean when they talk about a two-state solution. Just go to the West Bank and see where you'd put a Palestinian state right now.
Thank you very much, David Hurst.
Thank you.